Hello, welcome to our by Design Q&A Cafe today. It's Wednesday. Happy Wednesday, everyone. We have Alex Waddell. He'll be presenting our topic today, which is running Dunning balance confirmations inside by Design. Everyone's on mute, but please feel free to place your questions in either the questions box or the chat box, and we'll get to them as soon as the presentation portion is done from this session. And I'll let him take it away right now, and I'll mute myself.
Okay, thanks, Kayla. So, hi, yes, happy Wednesday, everybody. My name is Alex Waddell. I've been with HistoView for like 13 years now, and many years of B1 and by design implementations. My role in the organization is first enablement and training employees. So my background, though, is in finance. So those are the modules that I certainly understand the best. So today, as part of our cash management series, we wanted to show you how to do balance confirmations and Dunning letters and talk a little bit about the differences between those two different modules and open this up for questions. So as we were going through, if you have any questions, the audience is on mute, but you're welcome to type your questions into the question or chat panel on the meeting. And if I see, I'll try and keep an eye on that. If I see your question come up, try and address it as we go or at the end. So with that, let's get started. So Dunning letters, for those of you that maybe don't know what those are traditionally are kind of collection letters that are probably typically more used by sort of organizations that deal with maybe retail customers where they're getting more progressively aggressive with each letter as items age and get older, outstanding. Balance confirmations are more like statements that you send out, which detail any outstanding items in the subledger. And there's a few different variations of both. I'm going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each. I think for our purposes right now, we're going to start with the balance confirmation. I believe that most of our customers probably run the balance confirmation just because of sort of the idea of what Dunning really is as far as being a collection tool with aggressive letters, but you certainly don't have to use it that way. So let's kind of dive in and talk about this a little bit. So I'm going to go into the receivables work center. That's where we're going to be doing most of the overview here today. So inside receivables, you may be familiar with the customer accounts. So if you're in customer accounts, it defaults to the query of customer accounts with movement. And so right away, what pops up on your screen is a list of everything that is outstanding in your organization for your customers. And then there is the same thing with payables as well. And just so you're aware, the confirmation run exists for both payables and it exists for both receivables. We'll focus mostly on the receivables today, but there is no reason you wouldn't want to run this for balance confirmation for payables as well. You may have complex suppliers like, let's say, FedEx that send you a lot of invoices. So you may want to send balance confirmations and have them sort of confirm back to you that those are in fact all the outstanding invoices to help you reconcile with both your vendors and your customers. So when we're looking at the payables or receivables accounts and all the ones with movements, that means anything that has a balance on it is going to show up in here, regardless of whether it's a credit balance or a debit balance. So if we were to take any one of these accounts and click on the view, then of course that takes us into, once again, there's a by default filter here for just open items. So that 74,000 that we saw outstanding in the previous screen is made up of these two invoices in the system. And as these invoices get older, so this one's going back to October 17th, maybe it's getting a little bit alarmed that we haven't received a payment on this. So a balance confirmation is essentially a document that we can send out to our customers or to our suppliers, which help them understand what's outstanding. So very useful as a collection tool, very useful in advance of getting into collections. So you potentially want to have these jobs running quite regularly so that if you do send out an invoice, you're potentially within, even before that invoice is due, you're sending out that balance confirmation just to let them know that, hey, there is an outstanding invoice, may or may not be overdue. So how do we run those jobs? So in the receivables, much like many of the jobs inside ByDesign, many of the sort of output reports, it's divided into two components, being that one is the job you have to run, and then the second component is the accumulation of the data from that job, where we go to actually analyze it and process it. And you'll see that all through the system if you're running like work in process or GRIR. So lots of work centers have this concept of periodic tasks which run jobs, and then the output of those jobs are typically higher up in the work center. So in this case, you can see that here's where we run the job for balance confirmation runs. Once that job has completed, we would go into this different work center to see the output. However, the two are linked. You cannot get balance confirmations without first running the job. And it works the same thing for Dunning. So if we were to run the Dunning job, then we would have to go into the Dunning work center to see the output. So let's start first with what it looks like to run a balance confirmation job. I'm going to go into the screen and you will see all of the active balance confirmations. This could be an indication of somebody is currently has a job set up on a schedule, which means it runs at certain intervals. Potentially people have obsoleted those balance confirmation runs, so that's something that you can decide to maintain. You may just run this job once and it'll stay here as active until you go in and set it to be obsolete. So that's up to you how you want to manage it. You may decide to leave them all active, and every single month or every single period you just go in and run it on demand. That's completely up to you. But every single job that is set up with its specific parameters can be run as often as you want off that same job. So for example, you can see this Chicago without return letter has been run on 3 different occasions all today at 3 different times. So this is some testing I was doing earlier. So it's up to you to decide how you, if you want to launch an old job, if those parameters are there, or just start from scratch. If you've never run this before, then when you go in here, you probably are just seeing a blank screen. And so you're just going to say new balance confirmation run. That's what we're going to do right now. We'll show you how to build one from scratch. So we want to maybe give this run a particular description. Now, when you do a balance confirmation run, it's going to create a balance confirmation potentially for one or more customers or suppliers. That's going to be dependent on how you set up the parameters of the job. So when you give it your description, that's when you may decide whether or not you want to indicate the supplier or the customer name, or whether it is something more generic, like maybe you're just going to run this every month, in which case you could call this the monthly balance confirmations. You could do something like that. So whatever you want to just call it is up to you. For our purposes, so this job runs fairly quickly, I am just going to target my one customer. So we'll just sort of focus on the Chicago. And I'm just going to call this version 3 because I've already run this a few times. Now, when you create your job, you have some options as far as the output and whether you want it to have a return letter or without a return letter or a request. These are just document layouts that are available to you in the system. In a few minutes, I'll kind of show you where those documents are stored, and you may or may not have access to that. And if you want to change the layouts to your balance confirmations, that's something that your admin or IT may be able to do if they've been trained on that. If not, you can certainly reach out to us at VistaView and we can help modify these layouts. But out of the box, the default layouts are, you could have a layout that is essentially just more of a statement, so without a return letter. So it's just going to kind of send a 1 or more page, depending on how many invoices are outstanding, as sort of a reminder notice to the client. You could have one that indicates you want a return letter, so it would print an additional page where you're asking them to send back to you some sort of acknowledgement that those invoices are in fact correct. So once again, that could be very useful with a complex payables supplier where you'd like them to sort of return and say, hey, does your system match all of these outstanding invoices that shows we owe you? Please send that back to us, right? So it's kind of up to you which format, and then as I mentioned, you can manipulate these formats as well. So as far as your restrictions, you can automate the selection of customer suppliers, or you can manually select the customers or suppliers. If I want to get just a single supplier, I can really do either method. I'll show you that in a moment. As far as your output goes, do you want this to be released immediately? So what the release means is I don't necessarily want to review the output. I just want it to immediately go to my printer and print out. We'll talk a little bit about emailing options. There are emailing options with Dunning. I'll talk a little bit about the difference between those two. So if there is an emailing option, do you want this to just sort of automatically get emailed to your customer or your supplier without you necessarily reviewing the output first? So definitely, if this is the first time you're running this, I would suggest you do not check this box so that you have an option, the opportunity to review the output until you're comfortable that that's the way you want to run this job. And then your selection criteria for the specific items that are going to show up. So we are going to select the specific customer or supplier, but what is the cutoff date? Meaning which invoices do we want up to and until? So any items up to this date will be available on this. So I could just choose today's date, for example, or perhaps you want to set this in the past a little bit. If you have sensitive customers that don't like to get reminders of things that are not yet due, that's up to you. So you could set this cutoff date to be, 30 days ago or something like that. And then confirm or veto by. So this really works more in conjunction with the return letter. So do you want there to be a date on this letter that you're expecting your customer or supplier to get back to you by? So maybe you're saying, hey, we'd like you to look at this and let us know by the 15th if there's any inaccuracies in our records. I would say the business partner for the return letter. So you could associate the return letter to a different business partner. I can't think of actually an application where any of our clients are using this. However, the contact person ID could be useful. So this lets you select your users in the system. So for example, myself, I could indicate that I want my name to show up on those letters and my contact information so that if there are any questions about this, I am going to be the person to get the call or the email from this customer. So I do recommend filling out that field. So we're going to work through the wizard, these 4 simple steps. When we hit the next button, this is where the system is going to let us do, and you'll recall in the previous screen, it said, do we want to use automation to choose the companies? So all of that automation is, if I were to leave these blank, I am going to get every single customer for this particular company, being your legal entity. So you have all of your own companies in here. You may have one, you may have more, but you can only run this one company at a time. So if you do want to do balance confirmations for different legal entities of yours, you're going to have to run multiple balance confirmation run jobs. If you want to see what this would look like using the other method, which is the manual collection of customers and suppliers, then you also have sort of a similar idea, but you can actually go through and just sort of select specific customers. So this gives you a little bit more of a dynamic way to choose who you want to do a balance confirmation for. Unfortunately, there's no other additional criteria here, so you can't run this by group or anything like that. But this could be useful if your customers don't exist sort of in a range the way they would on that previous screen. So once again, if we're to do the automated selection, the only thing you can filter here is really a range of customers, so high, low based on the supplier ID. So either way, if I just want to run this for a single customer, I could use either method because I could have gone and found Chicago title in my list and moved it over to the right side of the screen, either way. So choose criteria for your customer. So you could filter this to countries and postal codes, but as I mentioned, you can't get into groups or anything like that. So that is one more filtering that you could do. And then choose criteria for considering balances on accounts. Do you want to set a threshold for this? Do you want to filter out anybody that doesn't have a balance? So that might be a good option to use if you are running this across all your customers. You potentially don't want to send 0 balance confirmations to people that don't owe you anything. But once again, that's up to you. So when I hit the next button, this gives me an opportunity to review the parameters. So this is just a summary of everything you saw in those first 2 steps. So now I'm going to hit the finish button, and I'm committing to having saved this job, but I haven't actually scheduled it to run in the system. So it's assuming that I want to do that next. I could optionally just walk away from this and come back to it tomorrow, or I can decide to just run it right now. And then you've probably seen the screen before if you do run jobs in the system. This is the standard job screen for scheduling jobs. If you want something to run immediately, you just leave it on this start immediately. If you do want something to happen based on another event or at a specific time, those may be less common, but potentially you may want to do things on a recurrence. So maybe you want this to run, for example, every month on a certain day of the month. For the balance confirmations, there's probably a lot of meaning in doing this so that you don't have to kind of do this manually each month. So I'm going to do the start immediately option, save and close, close again. And so I believe it gave me run ID number 9. I'm just going to hit the refresh button on the top screen. And so there's my, my run description for number 9. And as I mentioned earlier, you can have one balance confirmation run be the essentially parent kickoff parameters for an unlimited number of jobs. So if I had, in fact, set this to run every month, then what I would start to see is an accumulation each month on whatever day I decided to ride it. And I would see sort of the date when it ran, whether there were any errors or things like that. So this is running right now. You can see it probably took about 30 seconds for that to finish. So I just hit the refresh button, or you can hit the refresh button down here, and it's going to show me that this job has successfully finished. I may want to glance at this and see if there's any errors or warnings. I do have the ability to drill into this job. This is not the data that I want to look at for seeing the output to the customer. This is the data I would look at if I want to understand if that job ran correctly or if there are any issues with it. So if I go into the display log, I can see that these are successful. I could go in and I could look at the settings. I could expand. I can see the selection data I used. So it's really just telling me what were the parameters used to run this job. So that is probably useful to you only if there was ever some sort of error or warning for some reason that this job failed. So once this is working successfully, chances are the log files are something you're just going to ignore. What you're really interested in is the output. So keep in mind, this is run ID number 9. I'm going to go into the balance confirmation screen. So this is the work center where the output shows up. Once again, nothing's going to show up unless you have run the actual job itself. So you can see in here that there are a lot of balance confirmation runs that are waiting to be released. A lot of different people have their hands in this test environment and create balance confirmations. Some of these may be from time jobs. And the releasing action is the action that you do to actually send this to the customer, send it to your physical printer, so that you can create the final output. Because in this test environment, things aren't released, I kind of have this history in here. What you could do is just clean this up. And there's a few different ways that I could do that. So I'm going to scroll down because it's showing me the oldest ones to the top. I could, of course, resort these if I wanted to. So if I wanted to sort by descending, now I've got my newest ones at the top. So there's my run ID number 9. So I could, in fact, just sort of highlight all of these. Maybe let's do that right now. And I could delete them if I'm never going to release them. I could also set them to be voided. It's really up to you. Voided leaves them there. They just can't be used. So this is probably a little bit cleaner. So now in your environment, what you probably want to manage is this screen says not released because you're still working on it. Once you release it, then you would go in and look at either release balance confirmations or all balance confirmations to see the ones that have been released in the past. And so this list will always be growing. These historical balance confirmations are always something you can go back and look at if you wanted to. So while we're working on a pending not released balance confirmation run, you would work inside this particular view. And I would want to go in and analyze, well, what is the output on this? So I can see that there's $74,718. Let's hit the edit button and go in and have a look at this. So this tells me just through the regular ByDesign user interface what the outstanding invoices are. This is essentially the output that was generated as far as the criteria. So what did it select as the outstanding invoices? But what you're probably interested in seeing is, well, how is this going to look to my customer? And so for that, we can use the preview tab, and then we can do the print preview, and then we will have an opportunity to have a look and see exactly what it is that comes up. So this is the out-of-the-box standard balance confirmation screen that comes out. This one could be customized. I'll show you that in a moment. So you can make this your own. You can put your own company logo and things like that on this. But basically, it's just a list of any of the outstanding items. So where does that document layout come from? I mean, part of it came from the way this particular job was ran, because you'll recall that I just chose the option to create balance confirmations with a certain format without a acknowledgement letter. But there are a number of formats inside the system. So if you have access to the application and user management, if you don't, like I said, your IT department or your admin probably does. There's a couple of things that are driving these particular templates. So one is the form template selection, which does the default, sort of indicates, well, which template do you want me to default based on potentially the organization. So you have all of your different kinds of templates in here. So we're going to go down and we're going to look for balance confirmation, do a search on that. And so you can see that these are the out-of-the-box templates. These are the current layouts that they're linked to. And because there is no company identifier, that means the same layout will happen for all companies. So this is very useful to understand, because if you do have multiple legal entities in your system, you're going to want to ideally customize those templates, potentially put in different logos and things like that on just like an invoice or a purchase order. And this is where you would associate it to the particular company. And then the actual template itself is just stored under the master template maintenance. So, oh, I'm sorry, I think I went into the wrong one. It's the form template maintenance, my apologies. So we're gonna go to the filter here, and I'm just gonna go to the template group for balance confirmations, search on that. And that's where you can see you've got a bunch of layouts. So when the system is configured, you can decide what country, what language you want to go. You can customize these templates. And then you can see that there are different variations of this, like the account statement with due date, balance confirmation with return letter, things like that. If I were to go in and open one of these, and I don't want this to turn into a Q&A on how to modify forms, but just to give you an idea that it's pretty straightforward to do this. But if you've never done it before, we're happy to help you with it. So this is where you could embed the logo, and this is kind of showing us with some sample data what this template would essentially look like. And then of course you can go in here and you can make modifications. If you need more sophisticated modifications, you can also use the Adobe form editor as well, rather than the simplified one. Okay, so that's the form maintenance, but let's go back to our balance confirmation and talk a little bit more about some of the output options and then the difference between the dunning. So if we go to our balance confirmation, we can see this not released. You do actually have the option to swap out the template on the fly here, because you can go to your send options and you could change your template right here. So for example, the template we just looked at was called balance notification. If I want to do the one that says account confirmation with return letter, so here you can see the whole list, I can apply this. Sorry, let me just set this to be printer for now. Talk about that in a moment. And then we'll do the print preview on this. So this is the slightly modified version. There's a return letter that's attached to this, where it's asking you to go into the system, and then, or where it's asking your customers to essentially fill out this page and return it to you to indicate that there is a that the balance agrees in your system. Now, if I go into the send options here, one thing I want to point out to you is you do have the ability on the actual per customer output to decide to send this through a different method. So you have the option to use email, and at which point I could add how I want to route this. So I could put in that I want this to go to, let's say myself. and apply this. And that doesn't really change anything as far as my preview goes. But the assumption there, because I flagged it to email, is that when I release it, instead of printing a PDF to my physical printer, it's going to actually send an email to the address that I indicated in that pop-up window. How does that actually get sent? It gets sent by hitting the release button. So once I'm satisfied that this output looks the way I expect it to, I hit the release button and it tells me it's been executed. This is a test server, so I won't be getting an email from it. But in your system, if you did this, it would actually route this by email to whatever address you put in there. You saw that you had the ability to put in multiple email addresses. So if you wanted to also put in, let's say, your email address as the collections person, so you could kind of feel confident that the email went out, then you should get the email sort of the same time that they did. Oh, and actually, even though this is a test system, I did get the email. So how about that? So it actually sent it to me like this. So it sends it from the do not reply at the server and with that same PDF that we looked at. So once it's released, this balance confirmation is kind of done with. We could, you could do a repeat on the output if you wanted to. I don't know if that's that meaningful. But let's talk a little bit about the emailing. So this is where there's a difference between dunning and balance confirmations. So SAP has sort of designed this that balance confirmations are really more of an audit inquiry, something you potentially are doing one customer at a time. And therefore, they haven't really automated through the collaboration tab on the customer, the ability to email it. So that emailing process we did just now was okay, but unfortunately, you could imagine if you ran a balance confirmation for 100 customers, to have to kind of go into the preview and send options on every single one, and then update that emailing address would be pretty tedious. And then you'd be sort of faced with doing that every month if this is something you're setting out every month. So an alternative to that is to run the dunning. And the dunning has a little bit different configuration to it, but the output could be set up in exactly the same sort of way. It's up to you because you can design the outputs. So this is where you go in to create the dunning job. I'm just going to show you this quickly because the parameters are a little bit different. So you do not have all of the same options here to sort of go in and select specific customers. You do have the ability to filter on dunning strategies. So a dunning strategy is something that you can set up in the configuration of the system, and you can assign different dunning strategies for different customers. So for example, you could set up multiple dunning strategies, like let's say gold level customers, and you could assign that to your specific customers. So that's one way that you could filter out your customers if this sort of high-low range is not going to work for you. But you would run the job in the same sort of way. And then once it's finished, you would go to the Dunning Work Center to see the output. And it would also look similar to the other one in that you have that ability to do the preview, you have the ability to go into the edit and look at the information. But if I do the preview and I look at the Dunning letter, you're going to see that I come up and there is a different set of layouts for Dunning letters, but they essentially look the same. The idea is that there is a reminder information, there's a message, this is all customizable. How you want things to show up in the header is really up to you. So you can customize that, you can put in your own logo. With this one, when I hit the send options, I do have the ability to go in here and do exactly what I did. I can indicate that I want this to be sent by default by email. I do have the ability to change formats, but these formats, as I mentioned, are a different block of formats. So this one comes with two different formats out of the box, one called a reminder letter, one called a Dunning letter. So those look a little bit different. So if we open up this one, you can see this one changes the header. I believe the body changed a little bit, but it's a very similar layout. So what is the advantage of dunning? The advantage of dunning is I can have my default send information stored inside my customer, and that's a big advantage. So if I am to drill down to this customer, and I go to my View All tab, So this is the actual customer record for this customer. I'm going to go to my communications and I'm going to go to my collaborations tab. And you can see that Dunning Outbound is an available collaboration element. So in this particular customer, I had already set up that I want this to be emailed to me. I said indicated the template I wanted to use, so whether I wanted the Dunning or reminder letter. And once this is saved in the customer, this becomes the default method to always be used to communicate with that customer. So now instead of kind of going and finding that person's email address and updating it on the pop-up each time I run confirmations, I can instead set this up once inside the customer, and I can just collaborate on it each time. So if you're to go through this list, you can see that balance confirmations is not an available element for you to set. So all of that said, there is another way to get confirmations to be sent through an automation in your email, where the system will use a general email address. I believe it's the one set up in here. And that's by setting up what are called input-output channels inside ByDesign. I'm not going to get into that today, but I know that my colleague Laura is going to be doing a session on ByDesign input-output channels. I believe on June 1st. You can check with Kayla, our website, if I've got that wrong, but it's in early June. She'll be doing a session on that. So feel free to attend that session if you do want to see how to automate that balance confirmation using the input-output work centers. So before I close off, let's talk just a little bit more about the Dunning, because there's a couple of elements in the configuration that you may be interested in. Because as I mentioned, Dunning has to do with potentially progressively more aggressive collection action as things age. There are some configuration activities. I would say most of our clients aren't actually sending traditional Dunning letters. They just want to send out something that looks like a statement. But since you can get the Dunning to look like a statement, it doesn't really matter what it's called. So if I go into my configurations here for Dunning, it's got a minute to come up. We can open up our Dunning strategies. And this is where you have the ability to create as many Dunning strategies that you want. So out of the box, the system comes with two different strategies, so the global and the US. And in these things, you have the ability to update some parameters. So if you are dealing with clients in different countries and you want to have a foreign exchange setup, if you want to set thresholds on your Dunning, so you don't want to bother Dunning for things under a certain dollar amount. And then this is where you get into the Dunning levels. So how do you want to make your system get potentially more aggressive with your collection letters? So out of the box, there's sort of these 0 level, which is the reminder, level 1, level 2, level 3. And then you could have a different document layout customized and linked to that form template for each of these levels. And then those levels could, drive how. So an example, we're saying what is the interval that we want to look at? So how old does the invoice need to be before we start moving on to the next more progressive Dunning level? So I'm not going to demonstrate that because I don't have a template set up for all these different Dunning letters. If this is something that you are interested in exploring deeper, reach out to us and we could help you get that set up. But it's not too difficult. And so yeah, that's how you would get those letters sent out to your customer. So maybe the last thing I will mention is let's go back to our receivables, our balance confirmations. Since I don't have any released, I'm gonna just quickly rerun. Sorry, I'm gonna rerun my balance confirmation. So I'm gonna just cheat and use the one that I already created here. So I'm gonna schedule this, start it again. And then we're just going to give this a minute to generate another job. So while that's running, I'm just going to check and see if there's any questions here. So I don't think I see anything in the question channel. No. So if anybody has questions, feel free to put them in the panel. Okay, so that job is done. I'm going to go back to my, sorry, keep clicking on the wrong thing here, balance confirmation. So now we can see that I have this not released job, which I have the option of releasing to send to the customer. But I would point out just one other thing. So there is actually an action here that you could refresh the balances. So even though you've already run this, you could potentially leverage a previously run job and just choose this option to refresh balances. And just to sort of prove to you that that works, if we were to go into our um, customer invoicing, so I'm just going to cheat and copy an invoice that I'd already done for the Chicago for that 16,000. We're going to add a new invoice to the system. Maybe we'll just backdate it a few days. And we'll set it to be due immediately. So I've just successfully posted another invoice into the system. I'm going to go back to my receivables, to my balance confirmation. We're going to look at this 74,000, and then I'm going to go into my actions and I'm going to say refresh balances. And you can see it just increased to 91,368. So you don't necessarily need to rerun your dunning. If you do look at it and you see that there was something that was overlooked or not invoiced, you could go and correct that situation, come into your balance confirmation, use this action button to refresh it, and it sort of does a little mini refresh just on that one customer. And now if I were to look at the output, I'll see this additional $16,000 invoice that I just did for May 2nd. So that is that's what I wanted to show you. All right, then if there's no other questions, I appreciate your participation. I'll hand it back to Kayla, who can talk, I guess, about our closing and what's coming up next.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thank you for attending today's session. So yeah, next week is Wednesday, May 13th, same time, 12 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. We'll see you for interactive forums and ByDesign, and Laura Herculo is going to be presenting that next week. So thank you very much and have a great Wednesday.